Welcome back to Grace to Endure. In this video, we're going to answer the question that is actually in the text, and that is, how long does it take for all of these things to happen? Okay, so in verse 13, a question is asked about how long the events of this vision will take to happen. The answer is given in verse 14, and the answer is 2,300 evenings and mornings. I believe this is 24-hour days, and I think it's similar language to Genesis in the creation week, where it says the morning and the evening the first day, the morning and the evening the second day, and so on and so forth. So, okay, if you will look at the screen at the bottom, you will see that if you calculate it as 24-hour days, and you remember that the Jewish calendar year is 360 days, then you will come up with this number equaling 6 years, 4 months, and 20 days. Okay, now look at the screen, and we're going to look at what was in the vision. Let's just do a little review. First, we start the vision with Persia pushing. They push north, west, and south. Then a power from the west wipes them out. After that, during the Babylon time frame, there is a one world government that establishes itself and gets this whole global idea started. Then, probably during that same exact time frame, 10 start to rise. Powerful men who take authority as if they are kings, but they don't have a kingdom. That's important for us to remember. They don't have a kingdom, but they have power as if they were kings. They will hate secretly in the beginning, probably, but then by the end, they very much make it very clear that they hate Babylon, and so does the Antichrist. So together, they will fight Babylon and wipe out part of Babylon. Then those same 10 powerful leaders that are now called kings, as time has progressed, they give all their power to and all of their authority to the Antichrist. The Antichrist reigns for 3.5 years, and then Jesus returns. Let's look at the end of verse 14 and see what happens at the very end of this vision. Then the sanctuary will be restored. Okay, now look over at the interpretation to the vision and the end of verse 25. Yet he, talking about the Antichrist, will be broken, not by human hands. So when Jesus returns, he will destroy the Antichrist. We saw that in previous videos, that with the breath of his mouth, Jesus is going to destroy the Antichrist and the false prophet. So we know that the Antichrist is going to be destroyed by Jesus, so we know who's going to do that. It's going to be Jesus, and he's also going to restore the sanctuary at that time. So look with me at the top left of your screen, and I want to explain something in detail. So when you see the Bible talk about time frames, it having to do with the end times, you will see it said in 3 different ways. Sometimes it will say it in days, and it will just come right out and say this many days. Okay, other times it will actually say it in months, and other times it will say it in years. And the way that it describes it is times. That's how it describes it. So it will say time, that's singular. Times, that's got to be 2 or more. And then half a time, which if 1 year is time, half of that would be 6 months. So then if we put that together, we get 3.5 years. And when we compare it to all these other texts that talk about the same exact time frame, we know, because it will say exactly 42 months, which is exactly 3.5 years, and it will say exactly 1,260 days, which is also exactly 3.5 years. So when you put that all together, you realize, hey, the same exact time frame is being discussed here. So if you look at that left side, you can see all these passages that actually use this exact language. It either says it in years, months, or days. Okay? So there's a bunch of this, and we're going to look at that in the next slide. But for now, let's also look at the screen and see how I have it set up in these different colors. And I want to point out that in these different passages, we see 4 different days that are, in the discussion. One is 1,260 days. That's exactly 3.5 years. And it's said in all those verses there. And it's said in these 3 different ways that I have on the left side of the screen, the top left. And then you have another time frame talked about in Daniel 12 that's 30 more days. So you take 3.5 years and you add 30 more days, so about a month. So about a month more, okay, is talked about. And then we have another set of days talked about, and have it in the purple, and that's take the 1,260 days, so 3.5 years, add 30 days, and then another 45 days, okay? And you're going to see that this is also talked about. In the next slide, we're going to talk about what happens within these time frames. But for now, let's look at also the blue down at the bottom. That's the text that we're looking at today. It's Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, where it says 2,300 days. Okay? And so that seems like the vision of Daniel 8 takes place very fast. It's all within a short time frame, just shy, in fact, of 7 years. Let's look at Daniel chapter 9 and read from verse 20, the middle of verse 26. And the people of the coming ruler will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come with a flood, and until the end there will be war. Desolations are decreed. Verse 27. He will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering, and the abomination of desolation will be on the wing of the temple, until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. Now we know that at the end of verse 27, the desolator is certainly the Antichrist, and he will be destroyed at the end. Okay, so there is a view that this particular week that's being talked about represents 7 years, and if you look at and do the math for the verses up above it, you will see that this makes pretty good sense, that there is one set of 7 years still left. So then how does that match up with Daniel chapter 8, where we see that there are 6+ years left? So I find that interesting. Now, if you look on the screen, I have in yellow, I went ahead and set 1,260 days and then 1,260 days right next to it, because that's 3.5 years and 3.5 years, which would equal 7. So many people think that the Antichrist will perhaps be on the scene, but just not have taken full control until the last 3.5 years. Obviously, he's got to be, gaining power during that time. We know the last 3.5 years for sure, he has authority, full authority. Okay. And that's when he becomes very great. So that's the only section that I'm going to be dogmatic about, because the Bible is very clear on that. But this view that there's actually 7 years left that will involve this Antichrist figure is coming here from Daniel chapter 9. Okay, so I want to look right here at the middle of verse 27. It says, the abomination of desolation will be on the wing of the temple. I find that very interesting. And I'm going to show you, this is a replica of the temple. You have the courtyard, and you have the holy place, and you have the most holy place. And the most holy place, you have these cherubim, and that's where God's Shekinah glory came and rested between the cherubim. And this is a replica of things that are in heaven. So I find it interesting that the abomination of desolation is only set up on the wing of the temple and not in the most holy place. So let's set that aside and come back to that in just a minute. Okay, so look at the screen at the yellow section. The holy ones will be handed over to the Antichrist. This is a list. All these little points are just a list of things that these verses say will happen during this time period. So in the last 3.5 years, the holy ones will be handed over to the Antichrist. The power of the holy people will be shattered. The courtyard outside the temple of God is given to the nations to be trampled. Now let's look at that. That one is in Revelation chapter 11. So let's turn there. Okay. And I'm going to start reading in verse 1 just so that we have context. Then I was given a measuring reed like a rod with these words: Go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count those who worship there. But exclude the courtyard outside the temple. Don't measure it, because it is given to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. There it is, that same 3.5-year time frame. I will grant my 2 witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, dressed in sackcloth. And I'm going to stop there. That's all I'm going to say about the 2 witnesses. If you look at the screen, I have the 2 witnesses on the left side. And I don't know that for sure. It could be over here in the last 3.5-year time frame as well. The reason why I have it over in the first 3.5-year time frame is because if you keep reading in chapter 11, you will see that part of Babylon gets destroyed, and the 2 witnesses are there in Jerusalem. Okay, and they are prophesying. Okay, and then they die and they rise up, and I find it interesting who kills them. And we can see that in verse 7. It says, when they finished their testimony, talking about the 2 witnesses, the beast, that's the Antichrist, that comes up out of the abyss will make war on them, conquer them, and kill them. And then it goes on with more details. But then if you keep on going to verse 14, you're going to see that it says the second woe has passed. Take note, the third woe is coming. So when they are killed, it's not the end yet. There's still yet another woe, which matches up with other parts of Revelation, which we won't get into. So it doesn't seem like necessarily, it could be, but it doesn't seem like necessarily the 3.5, them fitting in the last 3.5 years works out exactly right. So it could be that they're in the first 3.5 years. That's just a possibility. Okay, so then I want to also show you then what did we just read in chapter 11, verse 1. It says, measure the temple of God and the altar and count the people who worship there. Okay, so what is this temple of God and where is it located? Let's look. It's in the same exact chapter. So in the context, I don't think we can say it's in a different place than the temple that's already being discussed in the beginning of the chapter to the end of the same chapter. So look in verse 19. Then the temple of God in heaven was opened. So where is this temple of God? I would propose that it's in heaven, and that when the Antichrist sets up on the wing of the temple, it's because that's the only thing he's allowed to get. Okay, the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of his covenant appeared in his temple, and there were flashes of lightning, rumbles, peals of thunder, and an earthquake, and severe hail. Okay, and it goes on, and this is, I believe, the return of Jesus right there in verse 19. So, interestingly, we have defined what the temple is. It's the temple of God, and where it's located, and that it's in heaven. So then, is there any other references to a temple that we could bring out to give clarity to this text? Well, I believe that there is, and it's the last 7 chapters of Ezekiel. It describes this temple that's never been built, and I would propose that perhaps this is a temple that is in heaven. And I also find it interesting, like I already mentioned, that the Antichrist only sets up on the wing of the temple. So even though it might look amazing what he does and how he sets up in the heaven, it's only the wing. And remember, there's lies about the heavens going on, so we need to hold true to what the scripture is saying. All right, so turn with me then, and we're going to cover this next point. Some will be kept safe in the wilderness from Satan's fury. To find that, we need to look at Revelation 12. So Revelation 12, verse 6, the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God to be nourished for 1,260 days. So this is exactly 3.5 years. Then you have this same thing talked about in verse 14. And then we have a second group. We have a second group on the earth, and those actually are in verse 17. And it's the rest of the saints who keep the testimony about Jesus and keep the commands of God. And this group is a different set of Christians who actually, the Antichrist wages war against them. And we see that again in 13, verse 5. So we see it again and again restated with just different details. And I think we can get a pretty good picture of what's happening in this last 3.5 years. Now let's look down at what's in red. And we see, if we look in Daniel 12, verse 11, something that is perpetual or regular is abolished, and the abomination of desolation is set up. I'm going to let you look up those verses and see where I got that from. So that's what's being done in the 1,290 days. Interesting. So there's the extra 30 days attached. Okay. So it seems, in my mind, to kind of give us a little timeline as to what might happen first. Okay. Then look at what's in purple. It says, happy is the one who waits for and reaches this point in time. And that is an extra 45 days. And it doesn't give much more information about that. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And then down at the bottom, let's wrap up by just going back to Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. And if you read the events that it says are going to be taking place for sure in this last 6+ years, it is the events of the Daniel 8 vision and the perpetual, and we know it's the perpetual being abolished, this thing that is regular, could be a sacrifice, doesn't have to be. The rebellion that makes desolate, that's the abomination of desolation. And then the sanctuary being given over and trampled underfoot, which that I think is referenced right there in Revelation chapter 11, verse 2 and 3, which we just read, that it's given over to the nations to be trampled. I have thoroughly loved and enjoyed doing this series on Daniel, and this video actually concludes the 24-part series on Daniel, and then trying to use Daniel to understand Revelation and Thessalonians. And so in order to help you with further study, I've actually just compiled all of our main passages that I've used throughout this study on one page, so that you can look at each thing on this timeline during that particular time frame and look up the verses and what the Bible says about that time frame, just so that you can get a better list to be watchful and waiting as these things approach.